So it's a big day. The Tory party has a new leader and the country has a new prime minister. But what does that mean for the country, for progressives, and for our work to change politics so that we can really change society? Joining me tonight to discuss all things Liz Truss and the Tories is, hopefully, Ken Spours, one of Compass's brightest and best, who through his work on the Osbourne Supremacy and Shapeshifters has helped us place a Gramscian lens over the adaptations and contortions of modern Toryism. Also joining us is Gaby Hinsliff, the fabulous Guardian journalist and columnist who writes so astutely about centre-left politics. But I think for a while we might be hearing more from Gaby than we do from Ken until Ken comes on board. The format, as ever, is we'll ask our guests some questions and it will be over to you, our members, for your questions and comments. It's a bit different this time as we're going to try and share a presentation deck of ideas that Ken has been putting together in advance of a bigger publication he's going to be writing up later in the week when we hear more from Liz Truss and how it works. So if we get Ken on board, then hopefully that work both visually and in terms of audio. So, hello, Gaby. You wasn't going to go first, but you are going to go first as we try and fill the space in beautiful, wonderful style, and we'll do it wonderfully. So, I mean, why don't you start? So we'll put it up in a minute, but you've just been writing about Liz Truss and what it means, and that's a pretty quick snapshot. But you've been thinking about it, you know, obviously over the long, elongated campaign. And I don't know how much you've come across her or how much you've seen her, but I guess in the kind of spirit of our kind of broad shapeshifter analysis, how much do you think that Liz Truss is going to be a kind of another conservative shapeshifter?
It's interesting because I first came across Liz Truss very shortly after she was elected, because she was one of those sort of bright young Tories that is sort of pulsating with ambition, really, who you think is clearly wanting to go somewhere. And in those days, she was a very Cameroon Tory. You know, she was absolutely one of the darlings of the coalition regime. You know, she believed in all the same things, as far as anyone could tell, that Cameron did. You would have put her on the, you know, very much on centrist sort of Tory, not fed up with the sort of stuffy old traditionalists, a moderniser, that kind of liberal Tory. That's absolutely the circles she was moving in. Over the years, I've watched her move, shall we say, quite a long blooming way from being, you know, in those days, initially, she was still loyal to Cameron by the end of the coalition parliament. She was a loyal Remainer during the referendum. And now we see this sort of completely almost new creature evolving, who is a pro-Brexit, friend of the ERG, hard-right Tory, who bears some resemblance to the old Liz Truss, but not a vast amount. The one thing that's been, I'd say, consistent throughout has been a belief in low taxes, in sort of quite dry Thatcherite economics and deregulation. Those are the things that have remained consistent throughout. But she is, as you say, a shapeshifter. She's very good at working out which way the wind is blowing, and then you'll suddenly find Liz Truss on the right side of it. And you saw that several times in the leadership campaign, where Rishi Sunak seemed to be much slower to pick up on the vibe, shall we say. And Truss's willingness to get in and say whatever the members wanted to hear did her a lot of good. It's not a very efficient way of running a country, but it's an extremely good way of running a leadership contest.
Yeah. So do you think that, I mean, it might not matter anymore in this kind of postmodern kind of fake news, whatever world, but is there a real Liz Truss? I mean, there was a real Margaret Thatcher, wasn't there? Although that evolved as well. Maybe just come back to that. But is there a real Liz Truss? And do we kind of know what it is?
Sometimes the reality is that a person is changeable, and that's what I think it's like with her. She is. Someone said to me when I was researching a profile of her, she's where the power is. That's what she always is. You know, wherever the action is, wherever there's a sort of, you know, way up the greasy pole, that's where she manages to find herself. That's how she survived three different prime ministers. But now she's where the power is, and in a sense that you know, you think at that point, well, you have to sort of step back and you have to pursue your own vision. But I think her freedom to pursue her own vision is going to be very heavily constrained by the economic circumstances she's going to find herself in, which are pretty dire, and would be pretty dire for, you know, the sort of most brilliant Tory leader who's ever lived. And I don't think perhaps most of the people who voted for Liz Truss even would describe her as that.
Okay, really lovely to see you, Ken. We're slightly relieved that we haven't got to make it all up, and we can make it all up with you as well. So that's good. Let's just let you get your breath. And And just so going back to that, I've been asking everyone who's even older than me, Gaby, what they remember about 1975 and when Thatcher became leader of the Conservative Party, and whether the left was complacent then. Now, you don't remember that, you know, even less than I can remember it. But I'm kind of, but most anecdotal evidence that I've got from people was that the left were complacent about Thatcher. But I guess, as you were beginning to allude to, Thatcher was elected leader of the Conservative Party and became Prime Minister 4 years later in very different economic circumstances and political circumstances, the end of the post-war settlement. And she had the bonus of North Sea oil, and she could sell stuff off and nationalize it. So there was a kind of, pot of money and the dying project. We'll come back to some of this, more of this with Ken, but the context for Liz Truss isn't anywhere near as good, is it?
Context is less. I mean, the 70s were a time of enormous turmoil, but I think the context for her is probably less benign now. The other thing that, I mean, actually, you're absolutely right that Thatcher was massively underestimated within her own party, by her own colleagues, as well as by the left in the mid 70s. But a large part of that, I think, was probably sexism, and was probably just, we'd never had a female prime minister before. It was something people couldn't imagine or countenance. How can a woman have authority over, a government of men? Whereas with Liz Truss, I'm not saying that, she's never on the receiving end of misogyny. Sometimes you can definitely hear it in the way people talk about her, but that's not, I would like to think that's not why people are critical of Liz Truss anymore. We're used to the idea she's the third female prime minister we've had. Yeah. We're not hung up on that anymore in the way we used to be.
So, Ken, do you want to just start jumping in? And if you could just give us a quick, because what you've been great at doing is applying, as I've said in the introduction, your kind of Gramscian thinking lens to the Conservative Party. Just for members and listeners, when the pod goes out, just give them a quick 2 seconds on, the way that Gramsci thought about political opponents. The hegemony point, the different nature of the kind of different wars that we could wage against them, etc., and how you've done that through your work for Compass on looking at the Conservative Party.
Well, you have to obviously remember that Gramsci wrote about all this in retrospect. He was in prison and reflecting on the defeat of Italian Revolution in the early 20s. But if you look at the corpus of his work on hegemony and on war of position, war of maneuver, and on political blocks, I think that what you'll find in his work is, in a sense, respect for the adversary, because he always wanted to kind of analyze the adversary, particularly those who had, like Cavour, who had exercised hegemony in Italian politics in the late 19th century. What Gramsci is remembered for, and this is why I think he is the greatest Marxist of the 20th century, is that he tried to understand how, in fact, a ruling class could rule through consent, not just through force. And so he was supremely interested in culture, in ideology, and he was writing in the wake of the First World War, and this is why he uses actually First World War military analogies of the war, trench warfare, the war of position, war of maneuver. He likened the Bolsheviks to the war of maneuver, storming, the Winter Palace and all the rest of it, where he said actually the kind of political conflict you have in the West is war of position. It's attritional. And so that whole analysis led to ultimately Eurocommunism as a more modern variant, and this idea that it's a long, hard slog in order to gain political power and for the working class to actually, rule for itself and to rule for others in society. When it comes to the Tories, I mean, I'll start with what Truss said about herself today. Well, the greatest political party the world has ever known. And in one sense, it's true, because the Conservatives, who are originally the party of the landed classes, have adapted to historical situations ever since. What's interesting, I think, and this is what I tried to do in my brief analysis since 2005, but you could go back to 1979, it's not just that the Tories adapt to what they think people are thinking. They certainly do that. They're highly attuned to that. But I think what they've tried to do since 79 and the neoliberal era is they've tried to shape thinking. And I think, so it's not just a retrospective adaptation. I think there's something far more aggressive in that. And you certainly saw that, I think, in the shape-shifting of Johnson. The shaping took place actually back in, after 2010 in relation to the EU and the involvement of the far right. So, and here we come to blocks. You can never talk about the Conservatives more recently without talking about the far right. And what's interesting now, and going back to Gaby's point about the difficulties that Truss faces, there is no reserve right-wing bloc.
So Ken, should we get your slides up and you can begin to talk to a bit of that, and then we can get some responses from Gaby. And I'm going to now do the complicated thing of trying to work out if I can share my screen, and everyone can tell me whether they can see that or not.
I can see it.
Well, that's good. Then everyone should be able to. So Ken's begun to sort of put his thinking together, and this will come out as a publication later in the month. So the first bit is you've got this analysis of three different eras of recent political identity change by the Conservative Party. Do you want to just talk briefly to that, and then Gaby, come back and tell us what you think about that?
Well, basically, not all reinventions are the same. And my argument here is that they're very context dependent. So you have a thing about David Cameron's modernisation. You've got an exhausted Labour Party. You've also got a large Lib Dem voting bloc in 2010. So his modernisation was necessary after 3 successive defeats. What's interesting about the modernisation was there was a lot of intellectual work going on in and around the Conservative Party and their think tanks. This is when I first joined Compass, precisely in relation to all of this, So that reinvention is subordinate ultimately to really neoliberal economics and austerity. So what I haven't done in the slideshow is to invoke this concept of Stuart Hall's double shuffle, but I do think there's a Conservative double shuffle. Modernisation was the subordinate part, eventually peters out. You're left with austerity, and ultimately then you're left with Brexit. So reinvention is one. The party over a period of years tries to, in a sense, re-engage with the 20th century and the 21st century. Theresa May's is a much smaller adjustment. It's quite, Nick Timothy helped her to develop this kind of Chamberlainite civic conservatism and what Nick Pearce calls her soft nationalism. But the shape shifting that's the dramatic change linked to Johnson's chameleon personality, political personality, and the rapidity of the change was 6 months in which the Conservative Party turned from being a Conservative Party to an English nationalist party. All I'm saying in this slide is you've got to then look at the context for Truss's ability to undertake any form of reinvention.
Well, let's come on to that. I mean, Gaby, how does that feel for you? Are we taking them too seriously? Is this all accidental, these kind of moves from one form to another, or is there real kind of strategic thinking, behind what they've been doing?
I never think I think you can't take your opponent too seriously if your opponent has just won the last 4 elections in a row, personally. Maybe it might be, then you've got something to learn. I think it's really striking seeing it laid out that way. The first thing that you see when you think that when you look at it like that is actually the only one of those that's authentic and genuine and personal, really, is the Cameron phrase. David Cameron turned the Conservative Party between 2006 and 2010 into the kind of party that he personally was comfortable in, that went in a direction that he felt was right. He saw himself as rescuing the Conservative Party from this sort of madness that it's sort of fallen into. And
heir to Blair.
Reinventing it not only heir to Blair, but also consistent with what Cameron himself personally felt, thought and believed in. Now, he didn't deliver on it in government because he didn't have, he was in coalition and, then sort of, the crash happened and he wanted to be Prime Minister for sunny, happy times, much like the Blair era, and that did not happen to him. With May, you have much more making the best of the situation in which she finds herself. She didn't vote for Brexit. She wouldn't have done it. And she didn't expect to be leader through this sort of time of huge kind of chaos and change. But also the other thing I'm struck by then is actually you can't quite divorce, you know, the idea that the shape-shifting started under Johnson. Johnson gave it life and personality and character and force and carried it over the line. But actually on the ground, that transformation started under May. It was under May that you first had the red wall sites, the red wall constituencies identified as places where, hang on a minute, these should be Tory. These are places where, you know, there are the kind of voters that in other parts of the country vote Conservative. So why don't they vote Conservative in Redcar or Cleveland? You know, that's what the origins of that was. And she actually Tories made a lot of progress under the radar in those seats in 2017. They took it close to the edge, and then it didn't take much for, you know, Johnson to flip those. But of course, you're right, it's Johnson that is the person we identify with this kind of whole transitional phase. The only thing I would do is split that Johnson period actually into, short as it was, into two phases. The first of which is pre-pandemic Johnson. It's sort of Johnson from when he ousts Theresa May to when the pandemic starts, which is basically this, you know, pulls off this really genius, if you want to look at it like that, you know, reinvention of the party and gets his huge majority and, you know, can command the sort of, you know, earth with it. And then Johnson post-pandemic, which is all about absolutely failing to deliver on everything he just said. You know, you've got levelling up Johnson, who says he's going to, you know, be a different kind of prime minister for a different kind of country. And then you've got, you know, 2 years of failing to do any of it, which if you were being kind, you could say was down to the pandemic. And if you weren't being kind, you could say was considerably down to Johnson's personality. And the interesting thing for me is how much Truss will sort of take on and develop some aspects of Johnsonianism, because I think she's learned a couple of tricks from him. I think she's learned some of her behavior, some of her ability to shrug off criticism, some of her uncomfortable relationship with convenient truths, shall we call it. I think she's learned all of that from him. Yeah, and I think what we're going to see is a sort of populism on steroids to some extent under Liz Truss, but it'll be less of a, you know, it'll be less about culture wars and it will be more about economic populism.
So Ken, do you want to just give us a top line on, you know, there's quite a lot of detail in this slide and people can watch it and we'll give people access to it who are listening to the audio as well. But just tell us, you know, what this matrix tells us about where we are.
Well, it was really an attempt to illustrate the dependency between the form of change that the Conservatives undertake and the context in which they find themselves. And I just want to say two things here. What I think is very, very important concerning the kind of confinement that Truss faces is the observation that the previous reinventions were linked to a reserve bloc, and that's where the appeal was made in terms of, you know, or either in the longer term in terms of the Cameron vision. I mean, Cameron didn't think he was going to have to go into coalition with the Liberal Democrats in 2010, but his modernisation didn't harm that relationship. In fact, it helped the relationship with Orange Book Lib Dems. May, on the other hand, very pragmatic, and I do agree with Gaby. I think the beginnings of the Johnson era, obviously found under Brexit, because that's the shaping force. And in a sense, so this is, I mean, he has a harder nationalism, she has a softer nationalism, but the beginnings are found there. She absorbs the UKIP vote in the 2017 election. It was just that Labour had this surprising surge, last-minute surge, which denied her, you know, she got, what, 42.5% of the vote, right, in 2017. But then you have and this is why you have to go down to the, it's shown in the graphics when looking at voting intentions and voting results over the years. You know, the Tories were electorally almost on their knees in early 2019, and by the end of it, they're on 44%. So, I mean, that was absolutely, utterly remarkable. And it's basically the absorption of the Brexit Party vote. But now, whatever agility Truss may try to demonstrate, she hasn't. She's got to eat into now established Labour, Lib Dem, Green, SNP blocks. She's got nothing else to go on. And that's very different from the previous inventions. One more thing I will just say about her narrative. Well, actually, we'll come on to her narrative, because I think that's going to be important about how she shows that she's fresh, how fresh, in a sense, what kind of refresh is Trussism or Trussonomics.
And Gaby, is there a kind of electoral kind of bubble that she hasn't, that hasn't been penetrated by the Conservatives yet, or an intellectual kind of source of energy and renewal that you can see on the horizon that we can't see yet?
I don't think there's, I think Ken's absolutely right. There's not a sort of, untapped pool of right-wing voters that somehow we've all been missing until now. The great change in that recent period has been, that for years back since, back to the 1990s, there was a split between the Conservatives and what was then the referendum party, and was then UKIP, and was then, there's been through various sort of incarnations through the years, but that split on the right was healed by Brexit. And that you can't sort of do that all over again. The only thing is that, she's starting from a majority of what was 80, cut a bit by people no longer sitting as Conservative MPs or people losing the whip or all the rest of it. But she's coming from a pretty high majority. The Conservatives can lose a reasonable amount of those voters and still just about hang on in next time. Not that anyone seems to be, or it's very difficult now actually to find Tories who think that's going to happen, and that is a marked change, I would say, in the last 6 months. It's a number of Tory MPs just like, that's it, we're going to lose, kind of thinking about what I'm going to do in 2024 because I'm not going to be doing this. That is a killer sign, shall we say. And the exhaustion of ideas, actually, because the other thing you asked is there a source of ideological reinvention? And this government reminds me very much, with knobs on, of that kind of feeling about Labour in 2009, which was, you've kind of run out of steam. You've been in government for so long that you have not had time to reinvent yourselves. You've not had time you're kind of going round and round in the same circles, and you don't really have any new ideas to offer. And that's where it's been extraordinarily vacuous in policy terms, this leadership contest. If you think back to what most people can remember from the hustings, you can probably remember an argument about tax cuts, and beyond that, what exactly? It's just something about speeding on motorways and everyone with an A star should get interviewed by Cambridge. There's nothing of substance there particularly, and it does feel as if they've run out of ideas.
Yeah,
I do agree in good part with that. But I do think, what's interesting is she said, I'm departing from the established orthodoxy of redistributive economics, right? And you have to think, well, where's that take you back? Well, you're basically back to Thatcherism. And basically, so in a sense, it's back to the future, but you're relying on people having fairly short political memories, so she will try and make this policy look as if it's new. It's certainly, I think in the moment, it's overwhelmingly aimed at the Conservative Party membership. It's now whether it can be aimed at anybody else. And I think this is where you get back to Gaby's point. I actually think there's some real difficulties ideologically, politically, that she's going to face. Because I would think they're altering the slide here, not talk about Trussism, because I don't think there is an ism yet. I think there's Trussonomics. I think there's I'd like to go back to this concept that Gaby raised of economic populism. Right? I think that's really interesting. And to pose one other question, perhaps Wes Streeting said he thought the Tories were trying to lose the election. All right, but what happens if they're just saying they're really aiming for 35%? What happens if they're trying to do, just enough to get themselves over the line?
Well, we know that Labour needs a 12% lead to get a majority of just one, because the electoral system works so solidly in favour of the Conservatives. And I just wonder, as I hear both of you speak, there's been a lot of talk about whether Labour is going to lose the BAME vote. Will that shift to the Conservatives? And I guess in terms of ideas, how much did it go back to the Thatcher conversation in 75? No one thought that there was, a current of ideas that was infusing her. I don't know if there's a version of Hayek's Road to Freedom, knocking around. But it's just, anyone who survives, in the cabinet for this long, and can win reasonably convincingly against Sunak has something about her. And I'm just kind of worried about us being complacent. But let's move it on. I think we've covered some of this ground in this slide. And this one just tells us where things are at. I don't know, there's
I just have a look there at 2019. You see the Tory dive. You've got the Labour dive as well. You've got big Lib Dem surges and big Brexit Party surges. Then as you go along to the right, it's settling down now into a relatively stable pattern. I'm not saying it's going to stay like that, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's going to bob about. And that's the difficulty she faces. The question is, with her, and we'll come back to her temperament and her qualities. I think we should discuss her qualities because a lot of people are just dismissing her. Let's discuss her qualities and let's see what's feasible for the Conservatives and then the onus that places on Labour and others.
Yeah, the other thing I'd say at this point is that we're probably relying a little bit too much on, current polling that for the last 2 months is really just measuring how annoyed people are with the absence of a government, fed up with Boris Johnson having spent all summer on holiday, doesn't look like anyone's doing anything about fuel bills. The country's a mess. No one's doing anything, and the arrival of a government, at least in number 10 might, that I can see if she comes up with a big package on fuel bills, there'll be an immediate feeling of relief because a lot of people just quite understandably think I was terrified about how I was going to pay my gas bill. Now I'm going to get some help. There's a certain someone's in charge factor. She might get a little bounce out of that. You don't know.
I agree. And it's interesting that Labour's factored that in. I think that's a good point, Gabby, that, people would I would welcome, obviously anybody would welcome her coming up with something which is not, in fact, Thatcherite. Yeah. In fact, it's what's interesting. Her big act is Keynesian. Right. I mean, that's, yeah.
Well, it could well be, and I guess I've got the slide up from the facts that Matt Goodwin's been putting about on his Substack, and I just guess that when anyone gets, and I'm not saying that you've done this in your analysis at all, Ken, because you're much too sophisticated, but that anything that becomes deterministic, I mean, we all remember the kind of Ed Miliband 35% strategy, that this is locked in, this is a given, therefore, if we just do this, then everything will be all right. And that doesn't explain events, and it doesn't explain changes, and it doesn't explain kind of political leadership, which can start to, to change things. So I'm just kind of trying to flag up the volatility and the changeability, and reinvention, pulling rabbits out of hats. I think you used that term somewhere, Ken. I mean,
I do.
Maybe that's a good point to go into some of the stuff about her and her ability to do this. Ken, did you want to say something? And then over to Gabby about her capabilities.
Just on Matt Goodwin. I mean, Matt Goodwin does his homework. That's the first thing. Yeah, he's a professor of politics. But I don't agree with that. In fact, that the Tories are going to implode, right? So I do think that there's something about Matt Goodwin's analysis which is on the bright side of optimistic. But I think it's now important to actually look at. Let's have a look at her qualities and her potential strategy with, in fact, a kind of a wariness, because I'm not feeling gleeful that she's been elected, right? Tory leader. I think we should just take, what in the saying in football, respect everybody, fear no one, right? So I just think it's going to be very important to understand that I think she's going to play a pretty straight bat. And that will be different from Johnson. She has a reputation for being fairly competent in governance, right? She may be very wooden when it comes to presentation. I hear that her speech this afternoon was not you wouldn't write home about it. I think what we're in for, though, is some pretty aggressive politics. I mean, really aggressive politics in terms of polarizations. I think things could get very bad over the winter, even with the package. And we'll have to also see who else is around her. because it's really Truss and Kwarteng, this one. You've got to put those two together, because you talked about Hayek. I mean, remember, we do have a manifesto for all of this. It's called Britannia Unchained.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, a decade ago, you know, 5 of them wrote this, and pretty, you know, the main themes in that are, yeah. Mark, somebody said it's not Thatcher economics, it's Reaganomics. And that's quite interesting, Gaby, what you're thinking about the supply side, you know. She says, I'm going to sort this out. I mean, she's pure capitalist. I mean, this in that sense, right? She's probably the purest economic form of Thatcherism that we've probably ever seen in a leader. Probably more than Thatcher herself.
So, and Gaby, how do you see the combination of ideas and personality coming together? What are they going to mean?
I think the key to thinking about Liz Truss is she is intensely hardworking. She is brighter than people give her credit for. I think there's often a tendency to kind of patronize or condescend to her, which she has found very irritating over the years, and which people have lived to regret, not least Rishi Sunak, who probably could have won this contest if he played it slightly differently to start with. And I think the Labour Party should have watched that very, very carefully. I think she is excellent at spotting which way the political wind is blowing and ending up wherever the political wind is blowing. I think those are her sort of good qualities. I think she's capable of forming relationships with other people and using those relationships well. And I think that's probably where I come to the end of Liz Truss's strengths, and have to start talking about the weaknesses, which are primarily that she's not secure in her own party. I mean, she's just won by a lower margin of victory than Ian Duncan-Smith had, Cameron had, Johnson had. That was closer than she was expecting it to be. And I wonder whether that's one of the reasons that it looked incredibly unconfident, her acceptance speech, actually. She delivered it like she'd just been given bad news rather than like she'd just won. I think she will have difficulties, of course, on the backbenches, given that 2/3 of her MPs didn't support her in the first place and don't have much confidence in her. But I think her bigger problems are going to be lack of confidence in her outside. I think there's not much confidence in her in the city. I think she's going to have potentially a difficult time convincing the financial markets of the merits of what she wants to do. I think the scale of the sort of potential borrowing likely under her government is giving a lot of people food for thought. And I think while she is capable of changing on a sixpence, she does so quite slowly. Her sort of style of decision making is very go around the rim, kick the tires of every single idea, however mad. She's always on about not wanting to fall in with groupthink. She likes to challenge consensus. You've heard her talk a lot during this campaign about challenging the Treasury orthodoxy, and I don't believe in abacus economics, i.e. believe that things have to actually add up. You know, I am a sort of a maverick who goes against the conventional wisdom, and she spends an awful lot of time doing that, only to be convinced a lot of the time that actually the economic consensus is the economic consensus for a reason, and that she's just wasted 6 weeks barking up the wrong tree. And you saw this, you know, the fact that it took her so long to turn around during this leadership campaign from a position which was basically unsustainable, which was we'll solve the fuel bill crisis with a few tax cuts, that's left her with very little time to put together the kind of package that she now needs to put together. It's going to have to be jammed together in a hurry. And I'm quite worried about the thought of a £100 billion rescue package in a crisis being cobbled together in a week and a half.
Okay, fantastic analysis from both of you. Let's just move it on and look at what it means for progressives. And before I bring Ken in to start doing that, just if you haven't asked a question yet, get into the Q&A bit and ask your question, because it'll be over to you lot just after we've done this. So Ken, start talking us through, you know, what this means for progressives, for Labour, for Liberal Democrats, Greens. You know, in terms of the possibilities and the probabilities of a consistent, coherent reaction.
Well, first of all, going back to Gaby's point about the government might get a bit of a bounce. Let's accept that that will be the case. And if you actually look at voting, voting intentions over the last year, when the Tories are in absolute crisis and killing each other, Labour has a lead of about 11 points, and when it all goes back to a little quieter, right, they get a lead of about 5 points. So let's just assume for the minute, that it's not double digits leads, it's single figure leads, right? Right. Now, that means that they can't win outright. And in fact, they've never had that possibility of winning outright. Yet, the real problem, I think, is that if the Labour Party declares that it's interested in relational politics, it would be labelled as weak and chaotic, right? And therefore, the real conundrum for the left in the broadest sense is, how do you collaborate, look strong, have direction, and exercise, in a sense, the greater intellectual political leadership? And I think that's, and we can all pathologize on how difficult it's going to be for Truss, and we shouldn't underestimate how difficult it's going to be. But it's also going to be very, very difficult for the left. And I at the moment, find it difficult to see a way through with some of the current thinking in the Labour leadership. I think it's going to, it could end up in an awful stalemate unless we can become far more imaginative and open in the way that we conduct politics, and use the next 2 years to do that, because we're not going to have a snap general election, I don't think, right? I think it is 2024. And I think we've got to really start to explore not just the practical policies, which in fact will be necessary and have to be posed, given the way that she's going to, in fact, take us down absolutely the wrong policy economic road, but how we alter the style of politics so that it becomes far more attractive. And I'm concerned about that. And I know that you're concerned about that. And I think it's a real problem for us and a real challenge.
How do you see it, Gaby, for progressives now?
I mean, like the good centrist mum I am, I'm a bit more optimistic than that about Labour's prospects. I do think, what struck me is the two things, the two policies, the windfall tax policy initially, and secondly, the freeze on energy bills, which Labour came out with first, which the government was then sort of very grudgingly forced to move in the direction of. That is new. That's something I've not seen the opposition do in a very long time, which is to be capable of actually making the weather, is to get a big judgment call right and force the Tories into line with it. If they can keep doing that, that's what makes voters look from the government to the opposition and think, hang on, that is the government in waiting. You are actually kind of doing the job already. I think there is a large block of, and this is where, I'd start to agree with Ken, and I also think there's a large block potentially of wobbly soft Tory votes there for the taking. That 43% vote for Sunak was the only place to go in that contest if you were either sort of an old school Tory who might be quite dry economically but likes to see competence and a track record in the city. But it was also the only place to go if you were a sort of classic soft home counties Tory who thinks the party's gone a bit mad under Boris Johnson, voted Remain, doesn't like all the culture war stuff, wishes we could go back to that nice David Cameron. Those voters are wobbling towards the Lib Dems. And I think it's going to be really important to watch. You look at what Michael Gove's come out and said in the last couple of weeks, MPs who have seats that are vulnerable to the Lib Dems have got a really big choice to make now. They've not got very long to save their seats, and probably their best hope of doing it is by rebelling against the Truss regime or by differentiating themselves from the Truss regime. And I think, those sort of wobbly Tory voters that you were frightened of voting Lib Dem under Jeremy Corbyn because they worried that they were going to let someone they didn't like in through the back door, are not nearly so worried about letting Keir Starmer in through the back door. And that's where the sort of big opportunity for progress is. I think we should probably also not forget, actually, though, about the non-English context. It looks to me as if Truss is going to be an absolute blooming gift to Nicola Sturgeon. Yeah. There's very obviously no love lost between them, and I don't think Truss has already it's very easy, I think, for Nicola Sturgeon to turn around and say in the middle of the energy bill crisis, well, I wouldn't be solving it the way she would. You know, Scotland and Wales would have taken a very different tack to this. I think Sturgeon will exploit that as well as she always does. And that should shore up the SNP vote in Scotland. And I think we'll probably come on to discussing Scotland at some point later, but that does present a problem for the Labour Party.
It does indeed. That's enough from me. Samuel, do you want to bring some much better questioners and points into the conversation, please?
Yes, I do. So I've got 3 questions to propose to you. I'm going to bring one of our members in, but the 2 other questions I'm going to say for the member. So the question from Mirwani is, the first question is, what are the chances of Truss calling and winning a snap election on the back of a popular vote to cap energy bills? The second question that was voted up quite nicely was, how can we present a good alternative to vote for all those who suffered and be let down and have given up on politicians, both national and local, as being all the same, myself included, or Nikki herself included, pushing their own agenda and playing their action cards according to the few that keep them in power? And Ray, you've come in. Would you like to say your question?
What reaction do you have to the recent YouGov poll that's shown that voters, including Conservative voters, have no real confidence in Liz Truss being able to actually make any improvement in the current situation? And do you think that that might cause her to, if you like, adapt to her policies to try and sort of fit in with what the voters think?
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Ray. What does everyone think?
I'd say on the question of are we going to have a snap election, she pretty much ruled that out in her acceptance speech. She said there was going to be an election in 2024. You know, I think she'd be nuts to go to the polls the way things are at the moment. I think she'd lose. We politicians always hope they'll improve things by hanging on. The question about how to sort of how to reach out to those voters who may have become very cynical and despairing of politicians and think they're all the same, you know, that really worries me actually, because I think they're going to be a growing group over the next year or so. And you know, in tough economic times, it's very easy to feel completely abandoned and left behind and ignored by mainstream politicians. And I think Liz Truss is likely to make that worse, not better. I wish I had an answer as to what brings those people back into the system, but I think it's something Labour should worry about, because I think there are going to be people who voted Brexit and then Tory in a kind of desperation for a big thing to change way. And I don't know what they're going to vote next time, but I don't think they're just going to sort of tamely troop back to the Labour Party in the hope of slightly moderately better funded public services, is all I'm going to say. And on the YouGov poll question, I think that's really bringing out something that we talked about before, which is the fact she's not secure in her own party. I mean, the sort of 2/3 of Tories who think they might quite like Boris Johnson back, I don't think that's because they think Boris Johnson was so brilliant. I think it's they're looking at the alternative thinking, is that it? You know, there's a distinct lack of enthusiasm. Will that make her trim a bit? I think it already has. I think that's the reason you're seeing her change tack on fuel bills.
Ken, any thoughts on that?
I pretty well agree with everything Gaby said. I think the question for me is, how significant and dramatic will the action on energy be? Because she's also got to reserve money for handing out for tax cuts. I mean, if she's going to do something, unless of course it doesn't, there is a plan knocking around. Gaby, you perhaps can fill us in a bit on this. There is a plan knocking around where basically the energy companies take out loans or what have you, so that none of this comes up on the government's books. And I think it's going to be that particular plan. I think Kwarteng was fine as well. It's kicking the fiscal can down the road, right? In order for 2 years for the energy companies, or at least the distributive companies, to take the strain, yeah. And then it'll be like PFI. We'll be paying back forever
There is a complicated argument which basically says, that the energy companies could take out, the energy companies do the borrowing and the government guarantees their loans. So it's not direct government borrowing to give them the money. Whether or not that would be classified as on or off balance sheet is a question for the ONS and not for me. But I think it might be difficult to sell as purely non-governmental borrowing on the scale it's going to be. But I think there are parallels with what happened with the banks in 2009 and, how exactly the bailout is constructed. And that's one of the things that I'm sure they're going over and over and over at the moment.
On the question of tacking and what have you, and going back to Gaby's point about her lack of security within the Tory party. That's one of the reasons why apparently she gave this very kind of inward-looking speech this afternoon. It was just aimed at the people who had just voted for her, or not, or in the case of 43% didn't vote for her, right? So I think they're going to also dominate in the next few weeks, in the coming weeks as well. As for Labour and this sort of disenchantment, I mean, Gaby, if you were not that I wasn't impressed with the way that Starmer tried to and has succeeded in making some short-term political weather around the energy crisis, but if in fact people will be impressed by practical policies, then Labour has got to project its portfolio much bigger and much more comprehensively than it's done thus far.
Yeah, and you can't just stop there. You can't do two policies and go, well, feet up, I've won the election now. But I think this summer, really, honestly, all anyone's cared about has been fuel. That's the big thing that's at the forefront of everyone's mind. People who don't normally listen to politics, don't normally pay any attention. It's been the one thing you've cared about. If the opposition had nothing to say about that, there would have been game over. I think the next area in which to pull the same trick if they can is the NHS. I mean, we've had a winter crisis, what we'd normally think of as a winter crisis in the middle of summer. So God knows where we're going to be by December, January. It's not going to be pretty. And, all Liz Truss kept saying on the hustings was, that she thinks the biggest problem in the NHS is bureaucracy and too many layers of management, and doctors aren't free to do what they, that is such a million miles away from being the sort of real problem within the NHS at the moment, that it sort of beggars belief. And it was noticeable when she gave the acceptance speech today. She said, I'll deliver for the NHS. And then would deliver what? How? What? There was none of that. It was literally just, oh yeah, and the NHS. And you just thought, okay, you do not have a plan here. And that is the one, that's the place that if Labour can't step in on that, then I'm not sure what it's for, really.
Right, let's get some more questions in, Sam.
Yes. So I'm going to bring in one of our members in. Vicky's going to be coming in shortly, but one of our members asked the question, is Truss strong enough to plough her own furrow, or will she give in to ERG? And Vicky, I'm just bringing her in right now to raise her question. If you just bear with us 1 second. Vicky, you there?
Oh, yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you perfect.
Okay. Well, it's quite interesting to see what Boris Johnson's reaction to this election between the two of them has been. I think he's sitting there thinking, she will make such a mess, he'll actually want to have me back in. And I think because all his life he's got away with all kinds of rubbish, he's always got away with it. And he still thinks he can get away with it. And I think that once he will try to look like he's being supportive, there'll be an undermining game, trying to undermine her and to let people know that what rubbish she's making of it. So I'd be interested to know what you agree with that and what you think about whether he will have any chance of success at all.
Well, I don't think he's going to be wishing her well. I mean, let's be quite clear about that. But that doesn't mean that she can't try and plough her own furrow. She is pretty. Gaby, you said she's pretty single-minded, right? And the question is, does she have sufficient allies around her in key positions for her to pursue her medium-term strategy, which is an absolute neoliberal economic strategy, right? So Johnson can Johnson can make mischief, but I think she'll still try and plough her own furrow, right? The question is whether, in fact, there comes a tipping point where people think, "Oh, this is a disaster," and I don't know. A lot of people don't know everything about football, but she reminds me of someone like Phil Parkinson. You know, you get a manager and you think, bloody hell, this is terrible. And then he goes and does the odd good thing and think, oh, that's not so bad. I mean, people don't exactly have high expectations at the moment of Liz Truss. And there may be an attitude in the country, well, let's just cut her a bit of slack for a couple of months. All right.
I'm sure that's the case.
I mean, what I'm suggesting here is we can have all the analysis in the world, but we should be prepared to be surprised, right?
And Gaby, would that surprise be? You know, can you what odds would you give on the return of Boris?
I think that's a Boris Johnson fantasy rather than a reality. But, you know, I've been wrong before when I thought he was finished, and, you know, he always comes back like some kind of bad dream. He is, I mean, I think, Vicky, you're absolutely right. He is going to make Ted Huth look like a graceful loser. You know, basically, I suspect, will end up with a extraordinarily well-paid column somewhere, and nobody's paying that kind of money for boring columns about how great the government's doing. All you want to do is see him throw rocks at his successor, and I'm sure he'll oblige. On the ERG point, actually, I would just say I think she gets to plough her own furrow so long as it's a furrow the ERG is happy with, and that's been the case for Tory leaders ever since 2016. You know, I think she may well not have too much problem trimming to ERG demands on for tax cuts, or for, you know, those accord to some extent with her own beliefs. But the ERG holds a lot of beliefs, not all of which are entirely, shall we say, reality based, and not all of which she'll be comfortable with. You know, there will be all sorts of expectations, not only that she doesn't renege on tax cuts, that she doesn't renege on her threats to trigger Article 16 and play hardball over the Northern Ireland Protocol. I mean, the sort of facts of the matter are that we need a trade war with the EU at the moment, like we need a hole in the head, but that is not going to go down well with the ERG. She cannot back away from that kind of rhetoric that she's used, so that's going to be very difficult for her to finesse. I mean, it was Reagan, wasn't it, who said that you dance with the one that brung you. You know, the people who got you elected, that's your base, and you have to stick with them. And that will be particularly true for Truss because she doesn't have a wide base. You know, the non-ERG bit of the parliamentary party was suspicious about her from the beginning. So if she breaks with the ERG, she doesn't have a base at that point.
Well, she's not exactly an alliance builder. I mean, but the question is really whether, in fact, her competence and determination can cut some ice in the near future.
Success is unifying. That's what people have been saying for the last few weeks. Oh, how can the Tory party come back together after this very bitter, you know, blah, 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 blah. In the end, you know, parties aren't reunited because everyone comes up with a brilliant marriage guidance strategy. They're united if the leader's doing well. Everyone's, you know, people who were critical shut up, and people who were doubtful, you know, are re-enthused. If she can turn around that Labour poll lead, if she can get a bounce off the back of the energy bill, if she looks like she's managing competently, the party will reunite blooming fast around Liz Truss.
I agree.
And if she doesn't, then it will fall apart quite quickly.
So, I mean, in terms of reinvention, I think she's capable of a mini reinvention. I don't think it's a massive shapeshift. She's not a shapeshifter. And there's no shape-shifting territory. But given the non-decisive nature of Labour's opposition and the relationship between the opposition forces, that, you know, it could be Trussism is kind of just enough. Yeah.
Yeah. So she could
just enoughism.
If you assume that what a lot of Tories thought towards the end of the Johnson sort of era was true, which was that they thought people aren't really fed up with the Conservative Party, they're not really pissed off with what we've delivered or not delivered, they're just fed up of a Prime Minister who lies and threw parties during lockdown and is a sleazy, you know, just get rid of him and we can start again. You know, if you assume that was correct analysis, then Liz Truss should be enough of a break with the past, but I'm not sure that was a correct analysis. Yeah,
no, I think it's complicated.
It's complicated. Thank you both so much. That was a really good run through a difficult, as Ken says, complicated contextual basis for the call tonight. I have to say I'm nervous. I'm nervous about her. I don't feel, I'm not saying anyone is complacent. She's a survivor. She's a bit of an adapter. Let's see. And I don't, so Labour comes out with policies that they can just steal. Who cares, as long as it's done and done reasonably effectively? They will go long. There will be some green shoots. They can say they did Brexit, they did COVID, and they got us through, a terrible economic, period, maybe. And maybe that's enough because they only need 25 seats or whatever to have a comfortable majority. And where does that leave Labour if that happens? And that's 5 straight losses. Let's see. So thank you very much, Gaby and Ken, when you got here. It was fantastic to have you. Our September podcasts remain more fluid. So instead of the usual fixed dates, the next one will be a live podcast from the Labour Party conference in Liverpool at 6 o'clock on Monday, the 26th of September. We will be joined from the town hall by Andy Burnham, John Crados, Beth Winter, Clive Lewis, John Harris, and probably many, many more to go through where Labour is on PR, progressive alliances, and winning as one. Before that, we'll be live streaming our event at the Liberal Democrat conference in Brighton at 6 p.m. on the 19th of September with Layla Moran and other leading Liberal Democrats. And finally, we'll be live streaming from the Green Party conference in Harrogate on Saturday, the 1st of October at 6:15 with Caroline Lucas and other leading Greens to see how cooperation can deliver them. Until all of that, which I'm sure you can't wait for, thanks again, Ken. Thanks so much, Gaby. Thanks to all of our members on the call tonight. If you're listening and haven't joined us yet, please do so. We need you as much as you need a compass. And please, as ever, keep safe and keep hopeful. Until next time, good night.